Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and make sure this works. Go ahead and get started if I can get this going right. There we go. So I'm going to give you a short link where you can download the PDF. You can see everything on the slides, and one of the reasons I want to share that short link, there will be some graphics that come up, and I'm going to ask a question at the end of what is Zero Trust, and you can win a Hacking Kubernetes Threat Analysis book. So if you're familiar with container platforms, familiar with Kubernetes, this is a Hacking Kubernetes book. And so when I get to that link, you can pull it up on your phone or laptop. And when I ask the question, you should have the answer. And the other prizes are the network switch, right? Wi-Fi adapter and lockpick. So this was the abstract that was put up, and so I wanted to make sure it was in the PDF because there's a couple of read ahead links. And I'll be walking around some just for a minute, and then I'll have to sit. I had knee surgery, so I don't have meds now because it's been about 4 weeks. So I may be walking around and sitting, so excuse me if I'm around too much. But the agenda today, I'll talk about the topics. We'll go into Zero Trust, Service Mesh. I'm going to talk about Red Hat OpenShift and Service Mesh. But keep in mind the Service Mesh and based on Istio and Kubernetes, those are vendor agnostic. So everything that I go over, you should be able to install on your own and try Service Mesh and try some of the references that I'll give you for the workshop. And I'll show you how to do that. So hopefully you're able to use that public presentation link I have there and pull it up. And when you see me get to the DISA reference architecture diagram, that's the one that you want to pay close attention to when I ask the question for the book giveaway. So I will have to get used to looking down there instead of looking up at the screen or my laptop. So I am a principal architect for Red Hat, and I've been with them. I actually left and went back, a total of 10 years. And I focus on Department of Defense projects, but security-related initiatives. I spend a couple of days a week doing internal Red Hat initiatives and billable to the Department of Defense. And I went to University of South Carolina and University of Phoenix for bachelor's and master's in computer science and working on my doctorate of engineering now at Colorado State University. So the online programs at a lot of the universities are getting a lot better and helpful for those that are still working. And one of the things that I would like to say, if anybody in here is still in the service or planning on going into the service, I wanted to thank you for your service in any of the DoD agencies. I have spent a good bit of time on different DoD agencies, but Army and at Fort Gordon, I've spent a good bit of time lately. So what we're going to cover today, the first topic will be Zero Trust, and we could spend a lot of time on each of these topics, but we will hit some concepts on Zero Trust, then we'll hit some concepts on Service Mesh and some examples of Service Mesh, and then we will talk about a specific implementation example around Red Hat OpenShift and Red Hat Service Mesh. So what is zero trust? There are a couple of things I want to note on what is zero trust, and that is it is a security framework. When you talk to folks who say they have a solution for zero trust or a product, the solution you can get toward the zero trust framework, but getting a specific product that covers everything in the framework, that is more difficult, and we'll go through some of that. But the main concepts around zero trust are getting away from Castle and Moat and making the perimeter more important than assuming there's a breach or a possible issue internally. So when we go through some of the other references, we always want to make sure from end to end that there's encryption, that you have multi-factor authentication, that you're looking at least privilege, and that's all the way through network and up the stack. Now we can't look at perimeter and say that we have a firewall or we have disconnected ops. We have to assume that there is a breach inside the network at all times. And we also need to be able to analyze within anything going on the network. So now we want to make sure that with no traditional network edge, and we're going into more IoT, there are more edge devices that we're looking at DAS, which is the data assets, applications, and services. So is that okay? Yeah, it's just this little bit smaller. So a couple of things on the timeline for zero trust. Zero trust is not new. People have been talking about deperimeterization, removing Castle and Moat, concentrating on encryption and identity for a long time. And you'll notice this timeline talks about 2004 when there was a Jericho forum that talked about deperimeterization, and then went on to Forrester, which is an industry analyst, talking more about their thoughts on zero trust, and then going into Gartner with their Carta, and Google with Beyond Core, and Forrester's was ZTX. So you have all these different concepts previously from different industry analysts and organizations. But why is it important today? If we go over to 2019 into 2021, 2022, there's a NIST special publication that defines core components of zero trust, deployment models, and then the executive order from President Biden came out that there are certain things that you have to do, certain actions that the agencies have to adhere to. And I think in that executive order it mentions zero trust like 14 times, something of that nature. But the key is the modernization and moving to the cloud. And then the 2022 memorandum from OMB is not on this timeline. That was earlier this year, but it talks about specific actions that are required within the different pillars by the end of 2024. So what this talk focuses on is service mesh and some zero trust aspects, but there are specific mandates for DoD agencies and across the government to complete certain tasks within certain time frames. So I'm not going to read all these, but I did want to include it in the PDF so you can reference them. It's the executive order that I mentioned from President Biden. I put the OMB memorandum in there because in the appendix it lists all the actions that are required with the different pillars and specific time frames. And you can find different documentation from NIST, NSA, CISA, so forth, and get more of an understanding of the different aspects from what you need to build in your enterprise for zero trust. I went ahead and put some links to some of the global agencies, because it's not just the US that has said, oh, now I need to make sure everything internally is just as secure coming into my network. Now I have to make sure I am assuming that there is a breach internally that I always verify and I never trust. So now it's more about granularity and making sure that you're validating on every transaction, especially in microservices, which is what we're talking about with service mesh. So some of the core components and principles that are in the NIST special publication, and this diagram is, yeah. So you'll see this throughout the talk and the different diagrams where we have the control plane that manages configuration and for the proxies. And then you'll notice the policy enforcement points, which are the proxies for the microservices that we're going to talk about. But the important thing to note on this diagram is I'm splitting network traffic on the to the policy enforcement point. That is what is going to enable access to the enterprise resources. So as this says, the important thing is all the data sources and all communication is secured on the network, and everything is considered a resource. And then when we look at the core components, we have the enforcement point you're going to see in service mesh. You're going to see the decision point, and those should be thought about in everything, not just service mesh. Where am I enforcing policies, and where am I building the policies and making them available to make a decision for the enforcement point? So if you'll notice this is what I was mentioning a minute ago, the DISA Zero Trust reference architecture. So if you can take a note of this diagram, that's what we're going to talk about on the book giveaway in a minute. But you'll notice that there are 7 main pillars, 5 of which are the user, device, network, application, and data. But you'll notice over on the right-hand side, there are different color for automation and visibility. Some of these go across a couple of pillars, and some go across all. And the key here is looking at this diagram. It is a security model, right? And it is holistic security. It's not, I take authentication for a user and I'm done. It is a maturity model that you have to think about for customers to go from a basic to advanced, or a basic to an optimal maturity model on capabilities that are deployed. So one of the things that I like with this graphic at home with the CISOs, the multi-factor authentication, when my son asked me something, say, well, we need to do the multi-factor, go ask your mom too. And my wife just looks at me like I'm a nerd. So I like that picture a lot. So as I talked about, there's a zero trust maturity model that CISA put out. And this helps identify the traditional down to the optimal. So not just service mesh that we're going to be talking about here in a minute, but the different pillars and what you should look for in traditional advanced optimal. I look at this like DevSecOps and your pipelines that you're building. You're never going to be finished. If somebody says, I'm done, I put a product in for zero trust, it's not accurate because it's a complex solution with many capabilities that have to be installed. And one of the things that you note here with transition to zero trust is identifying the actors, the assets, looking at policies. And you'll notice identify candidate solutions. So what technologies and products should I be using so that I can get to deployment and monitoring, which is the very last thing. And this is just another view, another input on a maturity model that's in the DISA reference architecture. The other one was, this one's CISA. This one has traditional advanced optimal. This one in the DISA reference architecture has baseline, intermediate, advanced. But you'll notice they're similar in what they're looking for. But what I like in this one is the discussion on discovery and assessment. So if I were to go into a project for DoD, I would want to ask these questions and ask, how can I apply all those concepts on the project and look at a higher level program? What is the program doing for zero trust? And with this, these are Red Hat products. When you look at OpenShift, you look at Advanced Cluster Security, IDM, Ceph, and so forth. I like to be vendor agnostic, even though I work for Red Hat. I like to talk about open source technologies. So the key is not a Red Hat product, although I know everyone in here loves Red Hat and wants Red Hat products. The key is looking at the capabilities and how am I fulfilling that need or requirement. So I don't want to go too deep into this, but there are the old layer 3 rules that a lot of folks use, and some of the firewall companies are putting out next generation. And this is an example of a Kipling method that Palo Alto uses. And you'll notice it goes not just source, destination, port, protocol, but it goes from who, what, when, so forth across. And the middle one is around the enterprise guide, which is a book, but it goes into the subject, the target, the action, the condition. And then on the right, it goes into the XACML standard, which is fine-grained authorization. So the key here that I wanted to show is that we want the fine-grained authorization. We want to know more than just a couple of specifics about who's accessing a resource. We want to get down into the granularity. All right, so we're going to go ahead and give away the book. So please just raise your hand. Who can give me the capabilities, how many, and the exact ones that are in the data pillar? Oh, somebody has their hand up back there. Okay, so look at this closely. This is not the pillars, but the capabilities in the data pillar. So who sees something else? So Does anyone see that some go across pillars? Go ahead. Correct. I hate to ask you, but I can't walk that up there. So everybody had good answers, but machine learning is part of the data as well, and that's where I was trying to go. That's why I put spans 2 or less pillars to give a hint there that there's actually the machine learning that's included as well. So good. But I'm glad everybody was able to pull that up. So let's start going into service mesh. So this concept of service mesh, and within OpenShift, the service mesh operator is based on Istio. And that's one of the more popular service meshes. And we'll see additional examples, VMware, AWS, so forth, not just Red Hat. But just as we talked about with the NIST special publication, there's a control plane, there's a data plane, east-west traffic, right? And we have a sidecar that protects each microservice. So why do we want to do that? We want to control network traffic, we want to control the health, we want to separate that from within the any additional logic within the microservice. We also want to be able to observe and trace. So that's a lot of the benefits of the service mesh. So these two examples, the one on the left is AWS, and you'll notice that they have the concept of Envoy as well. There are multiple components that work within a service mesh for that network control and the segmentation away from the microservice itself. And on the right is Tanzu. So all these are around the Kubernetes container platform. So when we look at the service mesh data plane, we're looking at, as I mentioned, the sidecar controlling the networking and isolating those to the sidecar instead of being controlled by some other method. And so what does that give us? One of the things that the OMB memorandum indicated has to be done before fiscal year 2024 is end-to-end encryption, so MTLS, multi-factor authentication. What the service mesh helps with is some of that security with MTLS and service to service with certificates. So I know what service A and service B are and that they are authorized and can authenticate between services. Also the observability, circuit breaking, load balance, etc. So the data plane focuses on the network portion. Then when we look at the control plane, as I mentioned, this doesn't look at the data packets, but this does make sure that policies and configurations are updated in the proxies as needed on the data plane. All right, so as I mentioned, Istio is one of the popular service meshes. And we have our service A and B with our sidecar or our proxy, and we have the control plane with Istio, and it has some components that control discovery, certificate management, and so forth. So that has been accepted, even though it started a while back. I can't remember the exact year, but it was started a while back in the Cloud Native Foundation, recently in the Cloud Native Foundation, even though it's been around a little bit. What I wanted to show on the right-hand side, and we won't dive deeply into this because a lot of folks are still focused on sidecar or proxy, but when you look on the right-hand side, there's something called ambient mesh. And ambient mesh just came out recently in Istio. There was at least one guy that used to work at Red Hat that went to solo.io. And within that ambient mesh, they are trying to give the ability, instead of using a sidecar, to have a Z tunnel. So it's a mixture of being able to use layer 7 and layer 4 within this model. And so I have the links there that you can look at in the future. So as we talked about with service mesh, we have advantages and disadvantages. I feel like there should be music or something because it's so quiet in here. So with some of the advantages and disadvantages, we talked about the security observability. That's a big one. The reliability is another, and productivity and efficiency. And I don't know if everybody remembers the pizza as a service diagram that went all over LinkedIn and so forth. But now with service mesh, cloud native, or serviceless, on that far right-hand diagram, you'll see service mesh in there. And I need to change that pizza as a service to show that. And I don't remember who originally did that. But a disadvantage is some of the possible delayed communication. Now we have the proxies in front of the microservices that are intercepting and deciding what should go to the microservices. So depending on hardware, depending on configuration, that can be a delayed communication. So again, this is a different link, but it's ambient security and what they're trying to do. They're not trying to completely get rid of sidecars, but they're trying to build this ambient service mesh in Istio. So we have the PEP with layer 7 and a secure overlay. And to me, when I look at this, the biggest thing, or two big things in here. One is the separation of the application from the data plane, which we talked about the proxy and application being in a data plane, but also avoiding the multi-tenancy that may happen with your proxies. So it's a good read to see what's going on in the future. And I don't know when that will get into the service mesh operator for OpenShift or the other vendors. So just I like this image too with our service person protecting us, the zero trust model. But the three things to note here, as I was talking about a minute ago, was the certificate management between services and the MTLS. So those three really apply to authentication, authorization of services, communication between them, and the mutual TLS. So that's the two-way encryption. So I threw this out here just to, everyone I assume knows IBM bought Red Hat. And Red Hat is still continuing its open source, and OpenShift is one of their big products that we work on, different cloud providers and different verticals. But what I wanted to note here when we get into OpenShift and service mesh, the service mesh, we're talking about Istio, traffic control, Kiali, which is some of the traffic visualization, and Jaeger, which is that tracing. And I'm going to show that just briefly and give you links that you can try this in your own environment. But some of the use cases are listed here that you can go back and look at. But the zero trust aspects, you can see that in the different use cases for service mesh. And I know this is going to, hopefully this won't confuse everybody. Give me just a second. So when we go back to technology focus and how we can do segmentation and other things, you can see that service mesh can fall into these different capabilities, but it wouldn't solve everything that you need to solve for service mesh. I mean, zero trust. All right, so where was I? So you'll notice looking at this diagram and looking at how we've overlaid the ZTA core components that are in the reference architecture from DISA, from NIST, the NIST special publication as core components. This has our data plane with the proxy, and we have our control plane that has Istio, and it has the different components of Istio for discovery, configuration, and certificate management. And of course, we consider the proxy as the enforcement point. We consider the control plane and Istio daemon as the decision point. And you can refer back to some of what I was talking about with the right-hand side there for some of the bullet points. So I wanted to throw this in as well and talk about API gateways. So I make the assumption that if you've worked in microservices, you've started working in API gateways as well. So north-south traffic coming in through an API gateway, Red Hat has 3-scale, which is one of their products. And when we look at service mesh, we're going to see an Istio Ingress gateway for monitoring security policies, so forth. But in the demo links that I'm going to give you and show you just briefly, the 3-scale, so API gateway and service mesh can work together on north-southbound traffic. And then our service mesh really does a lot with the east-west traffic, right, between services and the proxies and the traffic and routing and so forth. So as you see on the left-hand side, it's the traffic into OpenShift within services, and then egress or external, which is on this diagram as well. So I wanted to show in this diagram on the left-hand side, if we didn't have service mesh and I wanted to control routing, I wanted to control certificates, I wanted to control what's going into my microservices, like a front end and back end, what would I have to do? I would have to do a lot of hard coding to make sure of what's going on if I was going to adhere to zero trust. On the right-hand side, you can see with service mesh, now I'm protecting my microservices, and I can do a little more with network policies, certificate management, so forth, segmentation. And the router, the traffic goes into the control plane and then goes through the proxies. So I'm going to hop over to the computer here in just a second and do a brief demo just to show you where you can grab some links to do a deployment on your own and have a similar environment. But just talk about a couple of these slides real quick. If you go to cloud.redhat.com, one of the things that I've liked recently that they've made available, I can do an assisted installer for a single node OpenShift. If I have enough resources in a VM or a single piece of hardware, I can go there and give it some specific settings configuration. It will build a ISO. You put that on a USB drive, stick it into your hardware, and it'll create a single node OpenShift, which is the enterprise Kubernetes. So I can have a container platform built pretty easily just by going to cloud.redhat.com. And then on that bottom right, that should be showing the cluster that I created at home. And what I'm working on now is the demo I'm going to show you is in something called demo.redhat.com. So it's a cloud demo system that you can show Red Hat products, and it has different demos. But you have to have certain access to it. So on this hybrid cloud patterns, if you're interested in different architecture, like software supply chain. So one of the other zero trust concepts that have come out is secure supply chain, the software bill of materials. And so with this hybrid cloud patterns, I'm trying to get a zero trust pattern in there as well, to have advanced cluster security, to have service mesh, to have some sample applications. So you could easily go in and deploy not just OpenShift. This assumes that your cluster's already there, but it can install specific operators like service mesh and do some setup with some applications. So I can just go look at the concepts and do some testing on my own, use the book that we gave away and try and hack Kubernetes or OpenShift. So that's currently in progress. But what is available that I think is a good reference, the demo itself on demo.redhat.com, you have to have certain access. But these three links, there's a demo walkthrough. The install from scratch allows you to install the different components, and in this case, it's single sign-on, service mesh, and 3-scale. And there's an ebook that goes into deep depth on the service mesh versus API management, or how they complement each other. So those are three really good references. And you'll notice on the top left, that diagram talks about service mesh. But in that demo, it goes into API management, single sign-on more. So that's just the initial diagram. And then on the right, that's Kiali for some visualization. And I'll show you some of that here in just a second. So let me walk or hobble over to my computer. And when we look at this walkthrough, so it shows the different components or demo assets. And we're going to go into the instance I created. So within OpenShift, you can see different routes. And this is a Kiali route that I mentioned a minute ago. Well, I'm going in there. If we go back to here and go to the one above, the second link, if you have a Kubernetes instance, you can really go into the install from scratch. Although it describes deploying to OpenShift, you could install these Istio and these other pieces, Keycloak, so forth on Kubernetes. But in this case, since we love Red Hat, we're going to go in here and look real quick. Let's see. And I know everybody in the video is seeing this, but this cluster is going to go away anyway, so that's okay. So don't do that at home. That's not very secure. Don't show everybody on YouTube your password and so forth. But what I wanted to show in here is going into our book info and going into our graph. And it's probably because I'm just going to go ahead and select a lot of these. Oh, that looks pretty. Not. So this should be that other diagram within that slide. But you can see the services, the ingress, and so forth. So you can go back and look at that further. But what is nice is I can go in here and I can run a curl. I can hit my API. I do this a whole bunch of times. And all of this is within this document to like walk through it. So if you wanted to look at your, what's going on yourself, and you went through the install from scratch, you could run through this demo and see how your service mesh is behaving. But the key here is if I go into distributed tracing and I go into traces, I should be able to drill down into, well, what's going on when I hit my product page, when I hit my microservices. So again, and this is using RecBin. I don't know if anybody's used that. There's some other tools out there too. So in closing, I know what we start at 3:45, so about 45 minutes. In closing, and then we'll do the gifts if that's okay. In closing, there are just a couple of things that, there are just a couple of things that I wanted to close with. And that is, we talked about no more Castle and Moat. The assumption of once you get inside a network, you're safe, and the bad actor, if he's kept out, you're good. You have to assume there's a breach inside your network at all times. So there is no more perimeter. Doesn't mean you won't have a firewall. Doesn't mean you won't have some of the things that you already have, but you won't depend on that. You'll make sure that all the security capabilities are there, and it goes end to end, and it goes up the full stack. And so multi-factor authentication and encryption, like I said, that's part of what agencies have to make sure of by 2024 is done. And Service Mesh helps with encryption, helps authentication, authorization between services. Of course, for multi-factor authentication for users, there's different technologies for it. One of those is the Red Hat single sign-on, plus others. And then the other two things to note is when you look at all of this information on Zero Trust, there's a big emphasis on assess and design and reviewing what you have and the use cases so that you can make sure all those capabilities and all those pillars that you're making your security posture better. You're going through the maturity model that we described. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. In this presentation, there are some references And I tried to make sure all the links were in there and they were valid, so you can always email me. If we go back to, oops. If we go back to here, if you scan that, that's my LinkedIn profile. And please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll be able to be glad to answer any questions that you have. And if I don't know the answer, I'll get somebody involved that has the answer for you. And I know we're getting late in the day and there's still football games going on. So thanks for everybody for staying with me. Hopefully all of it made sense. So let's go down here we want to do our giveaway. So go ahead and we'll open up the floor, ask me any questions. If I don't know the answer, I will be glad to find out. If it's really deep, then may have to get back to you on it. Yes? Yes. Yeah, so are the mics working? Is there one over there you can turn on? If not, so just to make sure, so the question was, can I automate deployment?
Yes, can you automate the deployment of some of this with Ansible, or are there some stuff that's already out there that does that?
Yes, so I will go back and update the presentation. There's a good workshop that one of the essays did with service mesh. And what I was trying to do on the hybrid cloud, that has some Ansible in it, and some of it's using, kicks off with make install, so I need to change that to all Ansible. But that's a very good question with Ansible, because when we look at those zero trust pillars and capabilities, automation spans the whole, all the pillars. So very good question. So not only deployment, but you have your infrastructure as code, your compliance as code, everything is code, and Ansible is a good way to have your automation. And plus, it's a Red Hat product, so I love it. But even if it wasn't Red Hat, I love Ansible. But Chef, Puppet, Salt, the others, those are good automation products too.
Is that zero price?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, do you have them? It doesn't work. So your question was my experiences with service mesh, and when you ask hybrid, are you referring to hybrid cloud or use? Okay, so that's one of the big things Red Hat is. So I'll give a company explanation. I know you might want to turn the recording off. No, I'm just kidding. So there's what Red Hat is doing, in my opinion, and they do line up well, is Red Hat is pushing on a lot of their sales plays, going back to basics like Linux, RHEL, automation, which was asked about a minute ago, and then their third one, container platform, I think was the third. So it's like those fall into different sales plays. And so they are starting to do more zero trust within those, and they're focusing not just private, which can be OpenStack, OpenShift bare metal, or OpenShift whatever private, but they're also doing the hybrid model, because at times it's difficult with a disconnected environment in the government, right? Well, I have to get everything on something and get it internal because I don't have comms for the internet. So at times it's difficult, although we have AWS and different classifications. But generally, the hybrid cloud model works well with certain data and certain things going on AWS or Azure or Cloud or one of the cloud providers. And Red Hat has some managed cloud services too. But then with your private cloud, that definitely opens it up to having more control over security and what's coming into your network. As far as service mesh itself goes, I started with Zero Trust last year, looking a little bit closer at it and talking to different customers like NASA and FAA and some others. And everybody had, what can I use? What is the product I can use to implement Zero Trust? And that's why I would say service mesh, I like it a lot to abstract some. Plus, one of the things I might have forgotten to say is you want your proxy in your sidecar where the application is not dependent on having it there. I should be able to change the setting and my sidecar gets deployed. But with service mesh, it fulfills some of those Zero Trust capabilities. So when customers or talks take place around Zero Trust, oh, I can use service mesh then to solve a majority of the problems. No, like I said, service mesh is a good technology, not just Istio, but there's others, right? There's Linkerd and some others. But it fulfills certain capabilities there, like we talked about, especially MTLS between services and that authentication authorization. Like we talked about it a minute ago, Ansible fulfills another part. Advanced cluster security, which is based on stack rocks. And there's a DISA-STIG, hopefully that will come out soon, on OpenShift hardening for the platform and the node. But there's a compliance effort too. So I like service mesh a lot, especially when they talk about the ambient mesh. That's not into OpenShift service mesh yet. So I know I'm kind of going long-winded here, but I like hybrid cloud. Talk about use cases and which is part of that is better. How to split those up, and maybe it is just private cloud that's needed, but it's all use case based. And that maturity model like we talked about. So did we have another price? That was good. Yeah. All right, well, feel free to send, are there any other questions? Feel free to send me anything on LinkedIn. If I can answer, I will. If not, I'll find the answer. And thanks for everybody staying late till we're at 4:40, right? Enjoy, grilling out, football games, whatever you're doing this evening.